The sound of a bamboo cane striking human flesh is a distinct, sickening noise. It is a sharp crack, followed instantly by a dull thud. And then, usually, a gasp of air, as the victim tries to keep from screaming. In the prisoner of war camps of Niigata and Tokyo Bay during the winter of 1943, this sound was the metronome of daily life. It marked the rhythm of the morning roll call, the tenko, where men stood shivering in the freezing wind for hours. It marked the rhythm of the work details in the shipyards. And most terrifyingly, it marked the beginning of the interrogations. For the Japanese officers running these camps, the brutality was not just sadism, it was a philosophy. They looked at the men under their command, the remnants of the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada who had surrendered at Hong Kong, and they felt nothing but contempt. In the worldview of the Imperial Japanese Army, a soldier who surrenders has committed a spiritual suicide. He has forfeited his honor, his status as a warrior, and his right to be treated as a human being. These Canadians, skeletal, covered in sores, coughing up blood from tuberculosis, were viewed as waste material. They were weak. They were cowardly. They were the debris of a defeated army, useful only as beasts of burden to be worked until they broke and then discarded. This perception of weakness was the foundation of the prison camp system. The commandant, a man we will call Captain Tanaka, believed entirely in the superiority of the Japanese spirit. He believed that the Western soldier was soft, reliant on machines and luxury, and incapable of the kind of stoic endurance that defined the samurai tradition. When he looked at the Canadians shuffling toward the dry docks every morning, heads bowed, dragging their feet, he saw broken men. He saw men who were primarily concerned with where their next bowl of rice was coming from. He saw men who flinched when a guard raised his hand. Captain Tanaka made a fatal error. He confused physical deterioration with mental defeat. He did not understand that inside those starving 80-pound bodies, the minds of the Canadian soldiers were not broken. They were sharpening. And they were fueled by a cold, concentrated hatred that Tanaka could not comprehend. He didn't realize that the weakness he despised was, in fact, a carefully constructed camouflage. The Canadians had learned very quickly that in a Japanese camp, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. If you looked strong, if you looked defiant, you died. So, they played the part. They acted confused. They acted clumsy. They acted terrified. But while they played the part of the broken slave during the day, they were fighting a secret, lethal war. They were the saboteurs of the Imperial Navy, and the shipyards of Japan were their battlefield. The Niigata Ironworks and the Mitsubishi shipyards were the beating heart of the Japanese war effort. Here, the destroyers, escort ships, and cargo freighters that kept the empire alive were built and repaired. The demand for ships was insatiable. The American submarines were strangling the supply lines, sinking tonnage faster than Japan could replace it. The pressure on the shipyard commanders was immense. They needed ships launched now. They needed repairs finished yesterday. This haste, this desperation, was the opening the prisoners needed. The sabotage started small. It had to. The penalty for sabotage was not just death. It was torture followed by a public beheading to serve as an example to the others. So, the Canadians became masters of the invisible break. It began with the accidents. A Canadian prisoner, let's call him Private Miller, would be assigned to a lathe machine, turning steel drive shafts for pumps. He was a mechanic back in Manitoba. He knew machines. He knew that if he set the lathe just a fraction of a millimeter off center, the shaft would look perfect. It would pass the visual inspection by the hurried Japanese foreman. It would fit into the engine, but it would have an imperceptible wobble. At low speeds, in the harbor, the pump would work fine. But 3 weeks later, when that destroyer was running at full flank speed trying to dodge American torpedoes in the Philippine Sea, the vibration would become critical. The friction would build, the bearings would seize, the pump would shatter, and a warship worth millions of yen would be left drifting and helpless, all because of a microscopic adjustment made by a stupid prisoner who had bowed and apologized for being slow. For months, this low-level warfare went unnoticed. The Japanese blamed the poor quality of their steel. They blamed the lack of proper lubricants. They blamed the inexperienced Japanese conscripts who worked alongside the prisoners. They never suspected the Canadians because, in their minds, the Canadians were too simple to understand the engineering. But by early 1944, the scale of the failures began to attract attention. It wasn't just pumps anymore. It was entire engines, Ships were leaving the yards in Tokyo Bay, sailing for the South Pacific, and then vanishing from the roster, reporting catastrophic mechanical failures. A cruiser returned to dry dock with its steering gear jammed, having steamed in circles for 2 days. A cargo ship's winches failed while unloading ammunition, dropping tons of high explosives into the hold and killing a dozen crewmen. Captain Tanaka received a visit from the Kempeitai, the dreaded secret military police. They were not interested in excuses about bad steel. They smelled treason. They told Tanaka that the statistical probability of so many failures was impossible. Someone was doing this on purpose. The atmosphere in the camp changed overnight. The beatings, which had been random, became targeted. Tanaka and the Kempeitai officers began to hunt for the ringleaders. And this is where their prejudice blinded them again. They assumed that a sabotage ring of this magnitude required officers. They believed that only educated men, leaders, could organize such a complex campaign against the Empire. They rounded up the Canadian officers, the lieutenants and captains who were held in a separate part of the camp or who worked as supervisors. They dragged them into the guardhouse. The screams that echoed from that building at night kept the rest of the camp awake. The Japanese used waterboarding. They used bamboo splinters under the fingernails. They used suspension hanging, where a man was tied by his wrists behind his back and hoisted off the ground until his shoulders dislocated. They demanded names. Who is organizing this? Who is giving the orders? How are you communicating with the Americans? The tragedy was that the officers didn't know. The sabotage wasn't a top-down operation. It was a grassroots insurgency. It was individual men, privates and corporals, seeing an opportunity and taking it. It was a nod and a wink between two men passing a bucket of rivets. It was organic. But the Japanese couldn't believe that. They couldn't believe that the peasant soldiers had the initiative to act alone. So they kept torturing the officers, convinced that if they inflicted enough pain, the network would be revealed. While the officers were being broken in the guardhouse, the real war was happening on the hull of a massive new troop transport ship sitting in the dry dock. This ship was critical. It was destined to carry reinforcements to Okinawa. Private Miller and a small team of Canadians were assigned to the electrical installation crew. They were working deep in the bowels of the ship, in the dark, cramping spaces where the main cable runs for the fire control radar were located. This was delicate work. The radar was the ship's eyes. Without it, the ship's guns were blind. The Japanese overseer, a brutal civilian foreman named Sato, watched them like a hawk. He knew the Kempeitai were investigating. He terrified the prisoners. He walked the catwalks with a heavy iron wrench, striking anyone who stopped moving for even a second. Miller knew they were under scrutiny. He knew that one wrong move meant death. But he also knew that this ship could not be allowed to fight. He had developed a technique that was practically undetectable. He had a small pair of wire cutters palmed in his hand, hidden by his work glove. When he was pulling a cable through a conduit, he would wait for the moment Sato turned his back to yell at another prisoner. In that split second, Miller would squeeze the cutters over the cable. He wouldn't cut all the way through. He would just crush the internal copper wire, leaving the rubber insulation on the outside intact. It was an invisible wound. The cable looked brand new. Even if you inspected it visually, you would see nothing. But the circuit was broken. When the Japanese technicians turned on the radar system, it wouldn't work. They would check the fuse box. Fine. They would check the radar unit. Fine. The problem was buried somewhere inside miles of bundled cable, hidden behind steel bulkheads. Finding it would take weeks of tearing the ship apart. But on this day, the tension was different. Sato was suspicious. He wasn't yelling. He was watching. He was standing right over Miller's shoulder, breathing down his neck. Miller's hands were shaking. Not from fear, he told himself, but from the malaria that racked his body every few days. He had to make a cut. He had to. But Sato was too close. Then, a distraction. Across the hold, another Canadian prisoner, a young boy from Quebec named Jean, dropped a heavy spool of wire. It landed with a deafening clang. Sato spun around, screaming. "Clumsy idiot!" He marched toward Jean, raising his wrench to strike him. It was the opening Miller needed. He crimped the cable, hard. He felt the copper snap inside the rubber. He slid the cable into the conduit and clamped it down. By the time Sato finished beating Jean, leaving the boy with a gash on his forehead and a likely concussion, Miller was innocently tightening a bolt, looking for all the world like a frightened, obedient slave. But the Kempeitai were not done. The torture of the officers had yielded nothing. So they changed tactics. They decided to put the fear of God into the general population. The next morning, the entire camp was assembled on the parade ground. The wind was howling off the ocean, freezing the sweat on the prisoners' bodies. Captain Tanaka stood on a wooden platform, flanked by the secret police officers in their dark uniforms. In front of them knelt 3 prisoners. They were not officers. They were enlisted men who had been caught stealing rice a few days earlier. But Tanaka needed to send a message about sabotage. He needed a scapegoat. "These men," Tanaka shouted, his voice amplified by a loudspeaker, "are criminals. They have betrayed the kindness of the emperor. They have tried to hurt the war effort. There are traitors among you. We know who you are. We will find you." He didn't accuse them of stealing rice. He accused them of sabotage. It was a lie, but it served his purpose. He drew his katana, the family sword he kept polished to a mirror sheen. The prisoners were forced to watch. They were forced to keep their eyes open. If anyone looked away, the guards would beat them. Tanaka wanted them to see the price of resistance. He executed the 3 men. It was brutal, messy, and terrifying. "This is the fate of anyone who destroys imperial property," Tanaka screamed, wiping his blade. "We will inspect every rivet, every wire, every weld. If we find one mistake, 10 of you will die." A silence descended on the camp. It was the silence of the graveyard. The prisoners were dismissed. They shuffled back to their barracks. The image of the execution burned into their retinas. In the barracks that night, the fear was palpable. Some of the men wanted to stop. "It's not worth it," they whispered. "They're going to kill us all. We just need to survive." Miller sat in the corner, nursing his small ration of rice. He looked at Jean, who was lying on his bunk, nursing his head wound. He looked at the empty bunks of the men who had been killed that morning. He knew the Japanese strategy. They were trying to terrorize them into submission. They were trying to break the collective will. If the sabotage stopped now, the Japanese would know that their tactics had worked. They would know that they had won the psychological war. But Miller also knew something else. He knew about the rivet. Earlier that day, before the execution, word had come down from the drydock. The troop transport, the one with the cut radar cable, was scheduled for a pressure test of its hull the next day. And Miller knew that the riveting team, led by a quiet, hulking sergeant from Nova Scotia, had been busy. They hadn't just cut wires. They had been working on the hull plates below the waterline. They had been using the sugar trick. The prisoners had discovered that if they mixed a small amount of stolen sugar scrounged from the docks, where cargo was unloaded into the red-hot rivets before hammering them in, the sugar would carbonize. It would create a brittle, porous seal. It looked solid. It felt solid. But under the immense pressure of the deep ocean, or even the stress of a launch, the carbon would crumble. The rivet would pop. Tanaka had promised to inspect every rivet. But you cannot inspect the inside of a rivet. The next morning, the prisoners marched to the shipyard. The atmosphere was electric with tension. The Kempeitai were everywhere, watching every move. The guards were jumpy, fingers on the triggers of their rifles. The troop transport was sitting in the flooded dry dock. The pumps were running, emptying the water to test the seals, or perhaps filling it. The procedure was complex, but the test was crucial. The Japanese admirals were waiting. Miller watched from the deck of a nearby barge. He saw Tanaka standing on the pier, arms crossed, looking smug. The captain believed he had crushed the resistance. He believed the fear of the sword had restored order. Then, a sound. It started as a low groan, the sound of metal under stress. Then a pop, like a gunshot. Then another. Pop, pop, pop. It sounded like a machine gun firing. But it wasn't gunfire. It was the rivets shearing off along the starboard seam of the transport ship. A jet of water, pressurized by the depth of the dry dock, sprayed into the hull. The sugar-weakened rivets were failing in a chain reaction, unzipping the steel plates like a cheap coat. The ship shuddered. Tanaka's face went white. He grabbed the railing. The sabotage hadn't stopped. It had escalated. And this time there was no hiding it. The weak prisoners, the broken men he had executed to set an example, had struck back from beyond the grave. And they had done it right in front of his face. The hunt for the ghost saboteurs was about to turn into a war of annihilation. The sound of the rivets popping in the dry dock wasn't just the sound of metal failing. It was the sound of Captain Tanaka's career disintegrating, as the water rushed into the breached hull of the troop transport, swamping the welding equipment and sending Japanese engineers scrambling up the ladders in a panic. Tanaka stood frozen on the pier. He looked at the ship, a vessel that was supposed to carry a regiment to Okinawa within the week, and saw it listing helplessly against the concrete wall. The damage was catastrophic. To fix it, the ship would have to be drained, the hull plates stripped, and the entire riveting process redone. It would take months. In the chaos, Tanaka looked down at the prisoners. He expected to see guilt. He expected to see fear. But the Canadians were doing exactly what they had trained themselves to do. They were running around like headless chickens, feigning panic, shouting unhelpful warnings, and dropping tools. They looked like the incompetent, clumsy laborers Tanaka had always accused them of being, and that was the trap. The Kempeitai officers descended on Tanaka like wolves. "How did this happen?" they screamed. "You executed 3 men yesterday to stop this. Why is the ship sinking?" Tanaka couldn't answer. If he admitted it was sabotage, he was admitting that the broken prisoners had outsmarted him again, right under his nose. If he admitted it was incompetence, he was admitting that he couldn't manage his workforce. He was cornered. In a rage, he ordered the prisoners back to the barracks. There would be no executions today. He couldn't afford to kill them. He needed every single pair of hands to pump out the drydock and start the repairs. The Canadians had bought themselves life with their own destruction. Back in the barracks, the mood was electric. They were starving, they were exhausted, and they knew the beatings would be severe the next day. But they had won. Private Miller lay on his wooden plank, staring at the ceiling, a grim smile on his face. He whispered to the men around him, "Did you see it? Did you see the water come in?" It was the first time in months that some of the men had smiled. They realized that their lives, miserable as they were, had a purpose. They were the anchor dragging on the Japanese Empire. As the spring of 1945 turned into summer, the war arrived at their doorstep. The B-29 raids began in earnest. The nights over Tokyo and Yokohama turned into infernos. From the camp, the prisoners could see the sky glowing an angry, pulsating orange. The air raid sirens wailed constantly, interrupting the work shifts. For the Japanese, the raids were the apocalypse. For the prisoners, they were the cavalry. The chaos of the bombings opened a new front in the sabotage war: arson. The shipyards were vast, cluttered places filled with wooden warehouses, oil drums, and blueprint archives. During an air raid, the Japanese guards would herd the prisoners into flimsy shelters while they themselves ran for the reinforced concrete bunkers. For 20 or 30 minutes, the prisoners were effectively unguarded in the middle of a burning industrial complex. Miller and his electrical crew saw their chance. They were working in a storage depot near the main generator room. The sirens began to wail. The distant thump, thump, thump of anti-aircraft guns started up. The guards shouted, "Take cover," and sprinted for the tunnels. Miller looked at Jean. Now, they didn't have gasoline. They didn't have dynamite. But they had the wick. It was a simple device they had perfected. A cigarette, a book of matches, and a pile of oil-soaked rags. You light the cigarette, place it so the burning end touches the heads of the matches, and bury the whole thing in the rags deep inside a pile of lumber or rope. It takes about 10 minutes for the cigarette to burn down to the matches. 10 minutes is enough time to get back to the shelter and look innocent. They planted the device in the back of the warehouse that held the spare parts for the destroyer engines. Then they ran to the shelter, huddling with the other prisoners, feigning terror at the falling bombs. 15 minutes later, smoke began to billow from the warehouse. It wasn't hit by a bomb. There were no planes overhead at that moment. But suddenly, the roof erupted in flames. The oil drums inside caught fire. The intense heat melted the steel girders. By the time the all clear sounded and the guards emerged, the warehouse was a total loss. The Japanese were baffled. They assumed it was a stray incendiary bomb. They assumed it was bad luck. They never looked at the shivering, emaciated Canadians who were coughing in the smoke, looking terrified. They never saw the satisfaction in their eyes. But the endgame was approaching, and it was going to be the most dangerous time of all. By August 1945, the supply of materials in the shipyard had dried up. There was no more steel. There was no more oil. The prisoners were put to work digging tunnels in the hillsides, fortifications for the final defense of Japan against the American invasion. The kill-all order hung over the camp like a guillotine. The prisoners knew that the moment the first U.S. Marine stepped onto a Japanese beach, the guards would machine gun them in the tunnels to prevent their liberation. Miller and the other leaders of the sabotage ring began to stockpile weapons. They sharpened metal shivs. They stole heavy wrenches. They made a pact. If they come for us, we take them with us. We don't go into the pit. Then came August 6th. A strange ripple went through the Japanese officers. They were whispering. They looked pale. A single bomb had destroyed a city called Hiroshima. The prisoners didn't know what an atomic bomb was, but they knew something massive had shifted. Then August 9th. Nagasaki. On August 15th, the routine of the camp shattered. At noon, the prisoners were locked in their barracks. The guards gathered around a radio in the courtyard. The Emperor was speaking. Miller pressed his ear to the thin wooden wall. He couldn't understand the words, but he heard the tone. It was a high, reedy voice, speaking in a strange, formal cadence. And then he heard the guards crying. Not the angry shouting of the drill sergeants, but the sobbing of broken men. The radio clicked off. Silence. For 3 days, nothing happened. The prisoners were left in the barracks. No food, no water. The toilets overflowed. The heat was unbearable. They were waiting to die. They thought this was it. The guards were working up the courage to come in and massacre them. Miller gripped his shiv, a sharpened piece of a truck spring. He sat by the door. "Get ready," he rasped, his throat parched. But the door didn't open for an execution. It opened for a miracle. On the 4th day, a low rumble shook the barracks. It wasn't a truck. It was a plane, a huge, 4-engine bomber flying so low it practically scraped the roof. The prisoners hit the floor, expecting bombs. Instead, the roof splintered as heavy canvas bags crashed through the wood and slammed into the floorboards. The bags burst open. It wasn't shrapnel. It was tins of Spam. It was cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes. It was magazines. It was boots. Miller crawled toward a bag. He picked up a can. It was marked U.S. Army. He looked up at the hole in the roof. The plane was banking away, and painted on the underside of the wing was a massive white star. "We're free," Gene whispered, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "We're free." The camp erupted. Men who hadn't walked in weeks dragged themselves to the food. They tore the cans open with their teeth. They ate until they vomited, and then they ate more. The guards had vanished. They had fled into the countryside, terrified of retribution. Only Captain Tanaka remained. When the American recovery team arrived a week later, a squad of giants in clean green uniforms, driving jeeps that looked like spaceships compared to the Japanese trucks, they found the prisoners waiting in formation. They were skeletons. Yes, they were dressed in rags, but they were standing at attention. The American lieutenant walked up to Miller, who was the ranking survivor in his bay. "Soldier," the American said gently, "stand down. You're going home." Miller didn't move. He pointed to the commandant's office. "Not yet, sir. There's something we need to finish." The Americans kicked down the door of the office. Captain Tanaka was sitting at his desk, staring at the wall. He had his katana on the desk in front of him. He looked up at the Americans, and then at the skeletal figures of Miller and Gene standing behind them. Tanaka stood up. He reached for his sword. The American MPs raised their Thompson submachine guns. "No," Miller said, stepping forward. He looked frail. A gust of wind could knock him over, but his voice was steel. "Don't shoot him." Miller walked up to the desk. He looked at the man who had tortured his friends, the man who had starved them, the man who had executed innocent soldiers to cover up his own incompetence. Miller reached out and took the sword. Tanaka didn't fight. He was trembling. He looked at Miller's eyes and saw the same thing he had missed for 4 years, the unbreakable will of the weak Canadian. "You lost," Miller said softly. "You lost because you thought we were nothing. But we were the ones who sank your ships." Miller turned and handed the sword to the American lieutenant. "He's all yours, sir." The journey home was a blur of hospitals, ships, and trains. When the Sea Force survivors finally stepped off the train in Winnipeg or Montreal, they were greeted as heroes. But it was a strange kind of heroism. They hadn't stormed a beach. They hadn't captured a hill. They had endured. For years, the story of the Hong Kong POWs was one of victimhood. The public saw the scars, the missing limbs, the blindness from malnutrition. They saw men who were broken by the war. But the men themselves knew the truth. They knew about the loose bolts. They knew about the sugar in the rivets. They knew about the fires in the warehouses. They met in Legion halls for decades afterwards. Old men with canes and trembling hands, and they would laugh. They would laugh about the destroyer that sank at launch. They would laugh about the radar that never worked. They would laugh about the time they stole the commandant's dog and fed it to the guards as rabbit stew. They knew that they hadn't just survived the camps. They had fought the camps. They had waged a war of sabotage that no history book would ever fully record. A war fought in the shadows with improvised weapons. Miller lived to be an old man. He never went back to being a mechanic. His hands shook too much from the nerve damage. But whenever he saw a ship, or a bridge, or a skyscraper, he would look at the rivets. He would look at the welds, and he would smile. He knew that strength isn't about how much muscle you have, or how loud you can scream, or how many medals you wear. Strength is the ability to look your executioner in the eye and know that you have already cut the rope. The Japanese guards had underestimated the starving Canadians. They thought they had captured a group of soft Westerners. They didn't realize until it was too late that they had locked themselves in a cage with a pack of wolves who knew how to wait. And in the end, it wasn't the American bombs that broke the spirit of the shipyard. It was the quiet, relentless, invisible resistance of the men who refused to be broken.